April 1st, 1939. Kagamigahara, Japan, 6:47 a.m. A wooden crate explodes open on the tarmac. Not with fire, not with shrapnel, but with something far more dangerous. Inside, wrapped in cloth, like a sleeping god, is a machine that will kill more Allied pilots than any other weapon Japan ever built. Mechanics tear away the packaging with bare hands. An engine cowling catches the morning light. A wing emerges, then another, and standing 30 feet away, watching every bolt get fitted into place with the intensity of a man watching his own heartbeat on a monitor, is Jiro Horikoshi. 36 years old, chief designer. The man who just spent 2 years of his life building something the entire aviation world said was physically impossible. In 6 hours, that machine will take to the sky for the first time. In 18 months, it will be killing men over China. In 2 years, it will be the most feared weapon in the Pacific. And in 4 years, the same obsession that made it unstoppable will make it impossible to fix, impossible to upgrade, and impossible to replace. 12-to-1 kill ratios in its first months of combat. Over 1,600 miles of range from a carrier-based fighter. A turn radius so tight that Allied pilots described fighting it the way soldiers describe fighting a ghost. Something that appeared from nowhere, couldn't be held, and was gone before you understood what had happened to you.
Đừng quên nhấn like, đăng ký và bật thông báo để không bỏ lỡ những video hấp dẫn tiếp theo. Hãy cùng chúng tôi khám phá thêm nhiều câu chuyện sự kiện lịch sử và những khoảnh khắc đầy cảm hứng từ quá khứ. Hãy tham gia cộng đồng của chúng tôi ngay hôm nay.
This is the story of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the most perfectly engineered trap in aviation history. And this is the story of why the man who built it, the man who devoted every waking hour to making it flawless, built its destruction into the same blueprint that made it extraordinary. September 1937. Tokyo. Japan is 2 months into a full-scale war in China, and the Imperial Japanese Navy has a problem that is threatening to embarrass them in front of the entire world. Their current carrier fighter, the Mitsubishi A5M, is a capable and well-built aircraft. But capable and well-built is not enough when your bombers are flying deep into Chinese territory and coming back shot to pieces because their escorts can't keep up. The ranges are too great. The enemy is adapting. Chinese pilots, flying Soviet-supplied fighters, are finding gaps in Japanese air cover and exploiting them with mounting confidence. So, the Navy does what military organizations do when a problem becomes politically unacceptable. They write a specification for something better. Not incrementally better, shockingly better. The new fighter must hit 500 kilometers per hour at altitude. It must climb to 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. It must have 6 to 8 hours of endurance with an external fuel tank, giving it the range of a small bomber. It must carry 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. It must fit within a 12-meter wingspan, so carrier elevators can handle it. And here is the requirement that will send the second competing design team packing their drafting tables and walking out the door forever. It must be at least as maneuverable as the A5M it was replacing. The same agility, more speed, more range, more firepower, heavier armament, no bigger. The engineers at Nakajima ran the numbers, looked at each other across a conference table, formally concluded the specification was physically unachievable, submitted their withdrawal from the competition, and went home. Jiro Horikoshi did not go home. He had graduated from the aviation laboratory at Tokyo Imperial University. He had spent time studying European aircraft design firsthand in Germany. He had built a career on the belief that if you understood a problem deeply enough, the solution was always inside it somewhere waiting to be found. He was not a risk-taker by temperament. He was a man who measured rivet tolerances in fractions of a millimeter and lost sleep over weight distributions that no one else would notice. And after weeks of brutal analysis, he reached the same conclusion as Nakajima. The specification was impossible. Unless you made one foundational decision that changed everything. The plane had to be lighter than any combat fighter ever built. Not somewhat lighter. Not lighter in the ways that engineers usually shave grams from an airframe. Lighter in a way that had never been attempted by sacrificing things that every other air force in the world considered non-negotiable. Horikoshi's team drew a line through armor plating for the pilot. They drew a line through self-sealing fuel tanks. They eliminated every gram of structural redundancy that wasn't mathematically essential to keeping the aircraft airborne under combat loads. And then they went further. They obtained access to an experimental aluminum-zinc alloy called Extra Super Duralumin developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries in 1936, stronger and lighter than standard aviation aluminum, but so prone to corrosive brittleness that it required a special anti-corrosion coating just to survive operational use. They engineered the wings and fuselage as a single integrated unit, eliminating the weight of the fittings that normally joined them. Flush riveting across the entire airframe, each rivet set with such precision that the skin felt like polished metal under your hand. The engine mounting positioned unusually close to the cockpit, shortening the rear fuselage saving weight and simultaneously improving the pilot's control leverage over the entire aircraft. Every decision was radical. Every decision was deliberate. Every decision was irreversible. When the prototype first flew on April 1, 1939, it weighed approximately 1.68 metric tons empty. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109, one of the finest fighters in Europe, weighed over 2 metric tons empty with far less range. The American Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which would meet the Zero in its first Pacific combat, carried a loaded weight of nearly 2.6 metric tons and a combat range of roughly 770 miles. The Zero, with its external drop tank, could fly over 1,600 miles. American naval analysts, when they first encountered Zeros attacking targets in China and the Philippines, looked at the distance calculations and concluded Japan must be operating secret aircraft carriers they hadn't detected. There was no other explanation for how a carrier-based fighter was appearing so far from any known Japanese vessel. They were wrong. The explanation was simpler. Horikoshi had simply made the airplane do what they said could not be done. That first test flight did not merely confirm the specification, it destroyed it. The prototype exceeded the top speed requirement by more than 10 miles per hour. Its climbing rate surpassed what the Navy had dared to ask. Its turning radius was unlike anything in Japanese aviation history. The engineers who built it were stunned. The Navy officers who watched it fly were speechless. One pilot called it the most responsive aircraft he had ever touched. The Zero entered service in July 1940 and was immediately deployed to China for combat evaluation. What followed was so one-sided that Japanese reports were dismissed by Western intelligence as propaganda. In its first 13 combat sorties over China in September 1940, Zero pilots flew against Chinese Air Force fighters and claimed 27 victories with 0 losses. American military advisors received translated reports and sent warnings to Washington. Those warnings were filed in a drawer. The dismissal wasn't stupidity. It was a confident cultural assumption deeply embedded and rarely examined that Japan was capable of competent imitation of Western technology, but not of surpassing it. General Claire Chennault filed detailed performance reports about the Zero's capabilities directly to Washington in 1941. They were quietly set aside. That dismissal would cost American pilots dearly. Beginning December 7, 1941, and for 6 months afterward across 2 oceans, here is what those reports actually described if anyone had read them carefully. A fighter that could appear over targets 500 miles from its carrier with fuel to spare. A fighter that could outturn anything Allied pilots were flying. A fighter with cannons that could destroy an aircraft in one short burst. A fighter whose pilot sat unprotected by armor, whose fuel tanks were not self-sealing, whose structural tolerances were calculated to the absolute minimum. A machine so perfectly optimized for what it was designed to do that there was no margin left for anything else. That last detail. Write it down. Because the margin Horikoshi refused to include in 1937 is exactly what American engineers would eventually use to kill it. But that comes later. In the autumn of 1940, the Zero is simply unbeatable. And the man who would become its most celebrated pilot is a 25-year-old flight petty officer from Saga Prefecture named Saburo Sakai. He is already a decorated veteran of the Chinese campaign. He was one of 70 applicants accepted out of 1,500 who applied to the Navy's pilot training program. 25 graduated. He graduated first. Emperor Hirohito personally presented him with a silver watch. He is, in every measurable sense, exactly the kind of pilot this aircraft was built for. Elite by selection, extraordinary by development, irreplaceable by nature. And Japan is about to burn through men exactly like him, the way a fire burns through paper. But on December 8, 1941, none of that is visible yet. What is visible is 45 Zero fighters launching from Taiwan at dawn, climbing to altitude, and beginning a 500-mile round trip to attack Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Nobody on the Allied side believes this is possible. The range calculation is impossible, American planners conclude. There must be a staging base they don't know about. There is no staging base. The Zeros land back on Taiwan after the mission with fuel remaining. Sakai shoots down a P-40 Warhawk on that first day and destroys two B-17s on the ground. The Zero is everything Horikoshi promised. Fast, lethal, impossibly far from home, and completely in control of the sky above the Pacific. The first months of the war are a rout. Over Ceylon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engage 60 British aircraft and shoot down 27 of them, losing 1 Zero. The Royal Navy withdraws its carriers from the Indian Ocean entirely. Over the Coral Sea and at Midway, the Zero dominates every individual engagement it enters. Allied pilots who survive their first encounter come back with the same description every time. It turns inside you before you can react. If you follow it, you're already dead. But something else is also true. Something the Zero's pilots don't know yet. Something that Horikoshi's blueprints reveal with brutal clarity to anyone who reads them carefully enough. The same choices that made the Zero untouchable in 1940 have given it boundaries. Invisible ones, hard ones. Boundaries that close like a trap the moment a pilot crosses them in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. Those boundaries are about to be found. Not by a scientist. Not by an engineer. By a Navy pilot from Paris, Tennessee, sitting alone at a kitchen table with a box of matches, moving them around on a tabletop in the dark, trying to figure out how to keep his men alive against a machine that wasn't supposed to have any weaknesses. And when he finds what he's looking for, the Zero will never be the same. In Part 2, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot crashes in an Alaskan bog and unknowingly hands the Americans the complete engineering blueprint for defeating their most dangerous enemy. His name is Tadayoshi Koga. He never intended to give them anything. He was already dead when they found him. In Part 1, we watched Jiro Horikoshi build the impossible, a fighter that weighed less than anything in combat aviation. A machine with 1,600 miles of range that made American analysts search for phantom aircraft carriers. A weapon so perfectly engineered that Allied pilots across 2 oceans described it the same way every time. You see it. Then you're dead. The Zero entered the Pacific War with a 12-to-1 kill ratio and owned every patch of sky it entered. But at the end of Part 1, one man was sitting alone at a kitchen table in the dark, moving matchsticks across a wooden surface, trying to solve a problem that the entire United States Navy had decided was unsolvable. His name was John Thash. And the problem was this. Nobody believed him. In the first 8 months of the Pacific War, the United States Navy lost more aircraft to the Zero than to any other cause. Wildcat pilots who survived their first engagement came back with the same report. You cannot outturn it. You cannot outrun it at low speed. You cannot follow it through a rolling climb without losing your angle completely. The Zero's agility at combat speeds was simply in a different category from anything American pilots were flying, and the institutional response from Naval Command was broadly speaking to tell pilots to try harder. Commander John Smith, Pacific Fleet Fighter Doctrine, 1942, said it plainly in a briefing that Thach attended in January. Our pilots need to be more aggressive. The Wildcat is a capable aircraft. The problem is execution, not equipment. Thach sat in the back of that room and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had read every available combat report from China. He had seen the performance numbers. He understood what the Zero was doing and why it was working. And the man at the front of the room was telling his pilots that the solution was courage. "Sir," Thak said, standing. "With respect, I've been running tabletop simulations based on the combat reports from the Sino-Japanese War. The Zero has specific aerodynamic limitations at speeds above 200 knots. If we build a doctrine around those limitations, instead of trying to match its turn, we can neutralize it." Smith looked at him the way experienced officers look at junior ones who haven't yet learned that meetings are not for ideas. "Lieutenant Commander Thak, the doctrine is engagement and aggression, that is all." Thak sat down. The briefing continued. Somewhere over the Pacific that same week, 3 more Wildcat pilots died turning left when a Zero latched onto their tail. But Thak had found something in the combat reports that nobody else seemed to want to look at directly. The Zero did not just have advantages. It had edges, hard ones. At speeds above 200 knots, its ailerons stiffened dramatically. Without hydraulic assistance, the pilot had to physically fight the stick against air pressure that multiplied as the square of velocity. At 250 knots, a roll required serious effort. At 300 knots, test reports described the ailerons as nearly frozen. The same aircraft that outturned everything alive at low speed became in a high-speed dive almost impossible to maneuver. The Zero also rolled significantly more easily to the left than to the right, a product of the large 3-bladed propeller's torque, combined with the aircraft's extreme lightness. In a dogfight measured in fractions of seconds, that asymmetry was not an academic detail. It was a door, and Thak was building a key. What he devised on that kitchen table was counterintuitive to the point of seeming suicidal. He didn't try to match the Zero's turn. He designed a system where 2 Wildcats would continuously cross toward each other in a weaving pattern, so that whenever a Zero latched onto one aircraft's tail and committed to following it, that Zero flew directly into the gun sight of the second approaching Wildcat. The Zero's superior turn rate was the mechanism of the trap. The closer it stayed to its target, the more perfectly it positioned itself to be shot by the pilot crossing from the other side. Thak called it the beam defense maneuver. He worked it out with matchsticks representing aircraft on his kitchen table over the course of several nights, adjusting crossing angles, approach vectors, and timing until the geometry was clean. Then he needed someone to test it against, someone good enough to make it real. Lieutenant Edward O'Hare was by early 1942 already one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Navy. He had received the Medal of Honor in February for shooting down 5 Japanese bombers in 4 minutes to protect the carrier Lexington. If anyone could simulate a Zero pilot of the highest caliber in a mock engagement, it was O'Hare. Thak found him in the ready room at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay and laid out the matchsticks on the table between them. O'Hare looked at the pattern. He looked at Thak. "You want me to pretend to be Japanese," he said. "I want you to try to kill me," Thak said. "If you can break through the weave, the tactic fails. If you can't, we take it to Midway." They flew the mock engagement 3 times the following morning. O'Hare pressed the attack from every angle he could find. Each time, the crossing pattern forced him to break off or accept a head-on shot from the weaving second aircraft. After the 3rd run, he landed, walked to where Thak was standing on the tarmac, and said 4 words. "It works. Brief everyone." On June 4, 1942, Thak led 6 Wildcats from VF-3 as escort for torpedo bombers approaching the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway. 15 to 20 Zeros bounced them before they reached the target. A Wildcat went down in flames in the first 30 seconds. His wingman's radio was shot out. By any standard calculation, this should have been the end. Thak called for the weave. In the chaos and smoke and geometry of that engagement for the first time in the Pacific War, the arithmetic changed. American pilots were killing Zeros faster than Zero pilots expected to die. Thak's section claimed 3 Zeros destroyed and several more damaged. His 6 aircraft, grossly outnumbered, survived an engagement that should have ended them in minutes. But the Thak weave was still a workaround. a way to survive against a plane that was still fundamentally superior in every aerodynamic category. What the Navy needed wasn't a tactic that exploited the Zero's edges. It needed the Zero itself. It needed to know exactly what was inside that airframe. Every tolerance, every system, every failure point measured and documented. And on June 4th, 1942, the same day, Thaka's Wildcats were fighting over the carrier fleet. A 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was about to hand the Americans everything they needed. He didn't plan to. He was already dead when they found him. Koga had launched from the carrier Ryujo as part of the Aleutian diversion operation, a secondary strike against Dutch Harbor in Alaska designed to draw American attention north while Yamamoto moved on Midway. During the attack, ground fire severed his Zero's oil return line. The engine would seize if he pushed the throttle. He reduced power and radioed his position, heading for the emergency landing site at Akutan Island, 25 miles east, where a Japanese submarine was waiting for downed pilots. His two wingmen followed. He spotted a broad flat area inland from the shore. The grass looked firm. He lowered the landing gear and made his approach. His wingman Shikada, circling above on his second pass, saw the glint beneath the grass. Moisture reflecting in the pale Aleutian light. Not solid ground. A marsh. He had no way to warn Koga in time. The Zero's wheels touched down and sank instantly into waterlogged earth. The aircraft flipped onto its back. The impact broke Koga's neck. He died immediately. His wingmen circled twice. They had standing orders to destroy any Zero that might fall into enemy hands. They couldn't confirm Koga was dead. They couldn't bring themselves to strafe a cockpit that might contain a trapped friend. They turned and flew back to the Ryujo. Koga's Zero lay upside down in the Aleutian bog for 36 days, invisible in fog. Undetected, perfectly preserved by cold and moisture in conditions that happened to be almost ideal for aluminum airframes. On July 10th, a Navy PBY Catalina, returning to Dutch Harbor by dead reckoning, after getting briefly lost, passed over Akutan Island through a gap in the clouds. A gunner named Wall looked down. "Hey," he called over the intercom. "There's an airplane on the ground down there. It has meatballs on the wings." Recovery teams reached the site within days. What they found stopped them in place. The Zero had spent 5 weeks upside down in subarctic conditions and was in astonishing condition. The engine was intact. Instruments were readable. The airframe was structurally sound. Koga was still in the cockpit and was given a respectful burial on the island. The aircraft was loaded onto a barge on July 15th and shipped to Naval Air Station San Diego. American technicians who handled the restoration later described what they found with something approaching reverence. The engineering quality was visible in every joint, every fitting, every surface. The flush riveting was perfect. The aluminum alloy was unlike anything in American production. The integrated wing fuselage construction was a solution to a structural problem that American designers had approached differently. It was, by the objective standard of any engineer looking at it, a masterpiece. It was also, in the same examination, a blueprint for its own destruction. No armor behind the cockpit. No self-sealing fuel tank liner. Structural margins calculated to the absolute minimum. The machine that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots had given itself to them completely. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders made the first test flight on September 20th, 1942. He would fly 24 flights in Koga's Zero over the following 25 days. 46 years later, he still remembered every one. His report was distributed across every Pacific fighter unit within weeks. The ailerons froze above 200 knots. Rolling right was measurably slower than rolling left. The carburetor-style fuel system cut out under negative G forces, meaning that if a Zero pilot pushed his nose sharply into a dive, the engine sputtered for critical seconds. The prescribed counter to a Zero on your tail was now specific, documented, and teachable. Enter a high-speed dive. Roll hard right. The Zero cannot follow at that speed without its ailerons locking. If it pushes negative G to stay with you, the engine cuts. Every weakness Horikoshi had built into the Zero to achieve his masterpiece was now a training bulletin. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh used that bulletin directly. He ended the war with 21 aerial victories, 17 of them Zeros, and received the Medal of Honor for 2 missions over the Solomons in August 1943. He described it afterward with the precision of a man who had read a document and stayed alive because of it. With a Zero on my tail, I did a split S full throttle and let my Corsair build speed to 260 knots. Then I rolled hard right. Tracers from the Zero passed under my belly. I knew from Koga's Zero which way to roll. If I hadn't known, I'd have rolled left. I'd have probably been dead. Gigay. But here is what the training bulletins could not fix, what the Thak Weave could not address, what Eddie Sanders' 24 test flights had revealed in the margins of his report, noted but not fully reckoned with. The Zero's weaknesses were now mapped. American tactics were improving. Better aircraft were coming. The Hellcat was in production. And Japan was still sending its best pilots into the line until they died with no reserve, no second tier, and a training pipeline that had never been designed to replace what was being lost. By the middle of 1943, Allied pilots were noticing something new in their engagements. The Zero hadn't changed, but the men flying it had. The precision was gone. The timing was different. The veterans who had made it terrifying were being replaced by men who had trained for months instead of years, and it showed in ways that were measurable and lethal. And then, in August 1943, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat arrived in the Pacific. 2,000 horsepower, a top speed of 380 miles per hour, over 200 pounds of cockpit armor, 6 heavy .50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, a plane built specifically, systematically, and deliberately to kill the Zero using everything the Akutan tests had revealed. Its designers had read Sanders' report. They had understood Horikoshi's choices, and they had built the answer. The Zero was no longer facing a workaround. It was facing a solution. And in June 1944, over the Philippine Sea. Every decision made since 1937 by Horikoshi, by Japan's training system, by the men who dismissed Chennault's reports, by the wingmen who couldn't bring themselves to strafe Koga's cockpit, was going to arrive at the same place at the same time. In Part 3, we will watch it happen. 430 Japanese aircraft, 900 American, and the most mathematically lopsided air battle in the history of naval warfare. A day so one-sided that the men who survived it named it themselves, and the name they gave it will tell you everything about how completely Japan's beautiful, fragile, irreplaceable machine had failed. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Japan build the finest carrier fighter in the world, and then watched America systematically dismantle the myth surrounding it. Horikoshi's Zero owned the Pacific sky from December 1941 through most of 1942. Then John Thak built a trap from matchsticks. Then Tadayoshi Koga died in an Alaskan bog and handed American engineers a complete diagnostic of their most dangerous enemy. Then the Hellcat arrived. Faster, heavier, armored, built specifically to kill the Zero using every weakness Sanders's test flights had documented. By August 1943, the equation had shifted. But shifted is not the same as decided. Japan still had carriers. Japan still had pilots. Japan still believed that one decisive engagement could break American momentum before the home islands came within reach. And in June 1944 they launched that engagement. 430 aircraft against 900. The result will be the most mathematically lopsided air battle in the history of naval warfare. This is where everything converges. June 1944. Aboard the carrier Taiho flagship of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Japanese naval intelligence has known for months that American fighter quality has changed. The reports coming back from combat units in the Solomons and New Guinea since late 1943 describe something the Zero pilots find difficult to process. The new American fighter does not try to outturn the Zero. It climbs away from the engagement repositions at altitude and comes back from a direction and speed that makes the Zero's superior low-speed agility irrelevant. The Hellcat hits 380 miles per hour. The Zero tops out at 335. In a turning fight, the Zero still wins. But the Hellcat doesn't turn. It dictates. It chooses the altitude, the angle, and the moment of engagement, and then it fires 6.50 caliber machine guns into an airframe with no pilot armor and fuel tanks that have no self-sealing liner. Japanese pilots who survive these engagements and make it back to their carriers are filing reports that senior commanders find uncomfortable. The kill ratios that had held at 12-1 in the Zero's favor through early 1942 have been collapsing for 18 months. By early 1944, in some engagement areas, American pilots are achieving parity. In others, they are winning. Vice Admiral Ozawa reviews these reports and reaches the only conclusion available to a commander who has been told Operation A-Go is Japan's last viable chance to break American carrier power. The numbers are bad. The trends are worse. The operation must proceed anyway. He has approximately 430 to 450 aircraft. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher has 900 aircraft on 15 carriers. But Ozawa has one tactical advantage he intends to exploit. Japanese aircraft have longer range than American ones. He plans to position his carriers beyond the reach of American strike aircraft and attack from outside the envelope, forcing Mitcher to absorb the strikes without being able to counterattack the carriers directly. On paper, the plan is sound. In practice, it depends on one assumption that is about to prove catastrophically wrong. June 19, 1944. 7:30 a.m., the Philippine Sea. Ozawa launches his first wave. 69 aircraft, including Zeros. They climb to altitude and begin the long approach toward Task Force 58. American radar picks them up at 150 miles. Fighter director officers aboard the carrier's Vector Hellcats to interception altitude with 14 minutes of advance warning. In 1942, Zeros materialized from fog without warning. Today, they are watched from the moment they leave their carriers, tracked every mile of their approach, and met at altitude by aircraft that can outrun them in a dive and outgun them with 6 heavy machine guns. The first wave loses 42 aircraft of 69 before it reaches the American ships. Ozawa launches his second wave. 128 aircraft. American radar has them immediately. Hellcats climb. The geometry of the engagement is brutally simple. The Zero pilots are attempting to maneuver at low speed against aircraft that refuse to engage at low speed. Every time a Zero tightens into a turn, the Hellcat pilot climbs away, repositions above 200 knots where the Zero's ailerons stiffen and attacks from an angle the Zero cannot rapidly respond to. The second wave loses 97 of 128. The third wave of 47 aircraft loses all but 7. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft misdirected near American airbases loses all but 9. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vratsiu launches from the carrier Lexington at 10 a.m. as part of the Hellcat screen. He is 26 years old, a veteran of 18 months of Pacific combat with 18 aerial victories before this morning. What happens in the next 8 minutes will make him famous. Vratsiu spots a formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the west. He counts them. 19. He pushes the throttle forward and climbs. The Hellcat responds with 2,000 horsepower. He selects the trailing aircraft first. Fires. The Zero catches fire immediately. The unprotected fuel tank does what unprotected fuel tanks always do when a .50 caliber round finds them. He moves to the next aircraft. Fires. Then the next. He is working methodically precisely the way a man works when he knows exactly what his aircraft can do and exactly what the enemy aircraft cannot. In 8 minutes, Vratsiu fires 360 rounds of ammunition and shoots down 6 Japanese aircraft. He turns back toward the Lexington with fuel to spare. When he climbs out of the cockpit, he holds up 6 fingers to Admiral Mitcher, standing above him on the flight deck. Mitcher looks at him and nods. Vratsiu is grinning in the photograph that will run in newspapers across America the following week. Not the grin of a man who got lucky. The grin of a man who did exactly what his training and his aircraft promised he could do. By the end of June 19th, Japan has launched approximately 326 carrier aircraft against Task Force 58. American Hellcat pilots and anti-aircraft gunners have knocked down close to 300 of them. Total Japanese aircraft losses over the 2 days of the engagement, including land-based aircraft, and those lost when American counter-strike aircraft found the Japanese carriers that evening, reach approximately 480. American aircraft losses are 123. The majority of those not lost in combat, but in night water landings, when fuel-exhausted pilots tried to find carrier decks in a moonless sea. A Japanese pilot who survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea and lived to write about it described the experience from inside a Zero cockpit. The American radar saw you coming from 150 miles. The Hellcats were waiting at your altitude or above it. When you turned tightly at low speed, the Hellcat climbed away and came back from altitude. When you dove, it followed without difficulty because its pilot didn't have to fight his ailerons to roll. The only escape was to run. You couldn't outrun a Hellcat. A shipmate of Vrachiu's watching the last aircraft land that evening said what everyone was thinking. It was just like an old-time turkey shoot. The name spread across the fleet within hours. History would record it as the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Naval Air Force that emerged from the Philippine Sea was in practical terms finished as a coherent fighting force. The veterans who remained from 1941 and 1942 could be counted. The replacement pilots produced in months by a training system never designed to scale had neither the hours nor the instincts to close the gap. And the Zero, now clearly outclassed in speed protection and firepower, had no successor ready. Horikoshi's team had known this moment was coming. The design philosophy that made the Zero impossible to replace quickly, the obsessive lightness, the refusal to include structural margins that would allow adaptation, meant that every attempt to upgrade the Zero ran into the same wall. Add armor, lose the turn. Add a bigger engine to compensate, add more weight. Add more weight, require more structural reinforcement. The performance envelope Horikoshi had created through years of brilliance was also a cage. The Zero could not be fixed because fixing it destroyed what made it what it was. The numbers tell the final story. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, approximately 750 experienced Japanese carrier pilots participated in the attack. By October 1942, 10 months later, roughly 400 of them were dead. By June 1944, the survivors of that original cohort were a handful. The training system had produced replacements in months who were being measured against veterans who had trained for years. The qualitative difference was visible in every engagement from late 1943 onward and catastrophic in the Philippine Sea. Japan lost the air war not because the Zero was a bad aircraft. It lost because the same philosophy that built the Zero elite by selection, irreplaceable by nature, no margin for error, no redundancy, no second tier, had been applied to everything. The pilots, the training system, the strategic assumptions, all of it optimized for brilliance, none of it designed to absorb loss. In the final year of the war, Japanese planners looked at their inventory and made the only calculation left available to them. The Zero was no longer a competitive fighter, but it still flew, it still had range, and it could carry a bomb. Of the 2,363 Japanese Navy aircraft that participated in kamikaze special attack missions, 1,189 were Zeros, exactly 50.3%. The plane that Horikoshi had said he wanted to make beautiful was used to destroy its pilots, along with everything else. The man who built it kept a diary in those final months. He wrote in it without pretense. Since the beginning, those of us who truly understood American industrial strength never believed Japan would win this war. We assumed our government had diplomatic measures in reserve. But now, bereft of any such move, we are being driven to doom. The finest aircraft Japan ever built. The most maneuverable carrier fighter the world had ever seen. And the man who designed every rivet of it had never believed it would be enough. In Part 4, we close the account. What happened to Horikoshi? What happened to Sakai? What happened to the Zero itself? And the question that military historians are still writing about today. How do you build the best fighter in the world and lose the air war? The answer is not what you think. And it never was. In 4 parts, we have followed a single engineering obsession from a drafting table in 1937 to the burning sky over the Philippine Sea in 1944. Jiro Horikoshi built the impossible. A carrier fighter, lighter than anything in combat aviation, with the range of a small bomber and the turn of a dragonfly. The Zero ruled 2 oceans for 18 months, achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible until they happened, and terrified Allied commanders who had dismissed the warning sitting in their filing cabinets. Then John Thack moved matchsticks on a kitchen table. Then Tadayoshi Koga died in an Alaskan bog. Then the Hellcat arrived. And in June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, 480 Japanese aircraft were gone in 2 days, and the Japanese Naval Air Force ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. But the question we left open at the end of Part 3 was not about battles or kill ratios. It was about the man who started all of this. What happened to Jiro Horikoshi when the war he never believed Japan could win finally ended? And what did the Zero leave behind? Because this story has a final chapter that most history books summarize in a single paragraph. It deserves more than that. August 15, 1945. Japan surrenders. Horikoshi is 42 years old. He has spent 8 years building, refining, and watching his creation be consumed by a war that moved faster than any aircraft he could design. The Zero he flew from a wooden crate in 1939 is now a kamikaze delivery system. The pilots he designed it for are mostly dead. The man who once fought Navy bureaucrats for fractions of a millimeter in rivet tolerances now sits in a country that has been bombed into rubble, with an aircraft industry that American B-29s have systematically dismantled, designing planes for a nation that the surrender terms will prohibit from having a military aviation program at all. For 7 years after 1945, Japan is banned from producing aircraft entirely. Horikoshi spends those years teaching. He joins Mitsubishi as a technical advisor and eventually moves into engineering education, passing the precision and the discipline that built the Zero into the next generation of Japanese engineers, none of whom will be allowed to use it for military aviation for a very long time. He is not celebrated in Japan the way American engineers celebrate their wartime designers. The Zero carries complicated weight in post-war Japanese culture. It is simultaneously a symbol of engineering brilliance and a symbol of the war that destroyed a generation. Horikoshi navigates this with the same careful precision he applied to rivet tolerances. He writes his memoir, Eagles of Mitsubishi, which is published in Japanese in 1970 and translated into English in 1981. In it, he is honest in a way that surprises readers who expect triumphalism. He describes the Zero as something he wanted to make beautiful. He describes the war it flew in as something he never believed Japan could survive. He receives the Order of the Rising Sun Third Class from his government. He dies in January 1982, at the age of 78, 4 years after Hayao Miyazaki first begins developing the ideas that will eventually become The Wind Rises, the 2013 animated film about his life. In the film's closing dream sequence, Horikoshi stands in a field of grass and watches Zero fighters fly overhead in silence. They are beautiful. They are cursed. The film's most quoted line comes from a French poet that Miyazaki wove into the story. The wind is rising, we must try to live. Miyazaki had read Horikoshi's memoir and found the heart of it in one sentence. All I wanted to do was make something beautiful. Saburo Sakai, the pilot, who embodied everything the Zero was built for, survived. He lost his right eye permanently and never flew combat again after Guadalcanal. He spent a year in Yokosuka Naval Hospital and another year training replacement pilots' work that left him deeply shaken by what the replacement pipeline was producing. After the war, he returned to civilian life, became a Buddhist, and opened a small printing shop where he employed veterans who couldn't find work elsewhere. In 1983, he traveled to Los Angeles and met Harold Jones, the American rear gunner whose bullet had shattered his canopy over Guadalcanal 41 years earlier. Sakai brought the flying helmet he had worn that August day in 1942, the hole from Jones's bullet still visible in the leather. They exchanged gifts. Two men who had tried to kill each other shaking hands in a California hotel lobby. Sakai became a motivational speaker in Japanese schools in his later years, his message always the same: never give up. He died in 2000 at the age of 84 of a heart attack shortly after a formal dinner at a United States Navy base in Japan. He was buried with military honors. The Zero pilot, who had graduated first in his class, received a silver watch from the Emperor and flown 560 miles home with a bullet fragment in his skull, had spent his last decades telling Japanese schoolchildren that perseverance was the only thing that mattered. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the man Sakai called the greatest Zero pilot who ever lived, credited with 87 or more aerial victories, and nicknamed the Devil by his own comrades, did not die in a Zero cockpit. He died on October 26, 1944, as a passenger aboard an unarmed transport aircraft shot down by American Hellcats over the Philippines. He had just delivered Zero fighters to a kamikaze unit. Japan's ace of aces was killed in a plane that couldn't fight back, on a mission that had nothing to do with the skills that made him extraordinary. He was 30 years old. The Zero itself outlasted the war. Captured examples were evaluated by American, British, and Australian test pilots after 1945. Britain's chief test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, flew one and said afterward that he had never flown a fighter that could match its rate of turn, calling it the finest fighter in the world until mid-1943. The evaluation confirmed everything Sanders had documented in 1942. The Zero was a masterpiece within its envelope. Outside that envelope, it was fragile, limited, and unable to adapt. The lesson that military engineers drew from it was direct and has been applied in every major aircraft design program since. Optimization without resilience is not engineering excellence, it is elegant fragility. The same principle now governs the design philosophy of every major carrier-based fighter in service today, from the F/A-18 Super Hornet to the F-35C. Survivability and adaptability are not secondary considerations traded against performance. They are primary requirements built into the specification before the drafting begins. The THAC weave itself survived the war and became part of standard naval aviation doctrine for decades. The principle it demonstrated that a tactically inferior platform can neutralize a superior one through coordinated geometry rather than matched performance was studied by military theorists through Korea-Vietnam and into the modern era of beyond visual range combat. The United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, established in 1969 and known to the public as Top Gun, built its foundational curriculum in part on exactly the kind of systematic tactical analysis that THAC pioneered on a kitchen table in 1941. The insight that you do not win by fighting the enemy on his chosen terms is not complicated, but the willingness to build doctrine around it rather than around pride in your own equipment requires a specific kind of institutional honesty that is rarer than it sounds. Here is the byhook that the Zero story teaches most clearly, and it is not primarily about aviation. Japan built a weapon so perfectly optimized for one vision of warfare that it could not adapt when that vision proved incomplete. The Zero was designed for a short war decided by agility and precision. The war it got was long, industrial, and decided by scale and resilience. Every design choice Horikoshi made in 1937 was rational, within the assumption that the conflict would be brief. Remove the armor, gain the range. Remove the self-sealing tanks, save the weight. Build pilots so elite that a small number of them can achieve decisive results quickly. Every one of those choices was correct for the war Japan thought it was fighting. Every one of them was catastrophic for the war it actually got. The obsession that built the Zero was the obsession that doomed it. Not because the obsession was wrong, because it was complete. There was no room inside it for doubt, for margin, for the possibility that the problem would change. American industrial resilience, which Japan's planners had acknowledged privately and consistently underestimated publicly, replaced every aircraft lost at Midway within months. It replaced every pilot lost in the Solomons, with 2 trained replacements within a year. The Hellcat went from design specification to Pacific combat in 29 months. Grumman's engineers had read Sanders' report and built the answer. Japan had no equivalent process. The training pipeline that produced Saburo Sakai could not be accelerated because its quality depended on its length. The airframe that produced the Zero could not be upgraded because its performance depended on its limits. Beauty built on the exclusion of resilience is fragile. And in the Pacific, the war became a test of resilience. Now here is the detail that almost no account of the Zero story includes, and it reframes the entire narrative. Tadayoshi Koga, the 19-year-old pilot whose death in an Alaskan bog handed American engineers the blueprint for defeating the Zero, is buried somewhere in Chidorigafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo, among 2.1 million unidentified remains from the Pacific War. No one is certain which grave is his. The pilot who changed the course of the air war in the Pacific has no identified resting place. His Zero was not preserved. It was destroyed in February 1945. In a taxiway accident at Naval Air Station, San Diego, struck by a runaway helldiver that sliced the airframe into pieces. The aircraft that made everything possible that gave Sanders his 24 test flights and gave Kenneth Walsh the knowledge of which way to roll ended as fragments in a box. The Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum holds a piece of the airframe. The National Museum of the United States Navy has some of the gauges. A plane that altered the trajectory of the largest naval war in human history exists today as spare parts scattered across two institutions that most people will never visit. Koga himself will probably never be definitively identified. The 19-year-old from Saga Prefecture, who flew the finest fighter on Earth, who reduced his throttle to spare a damaged engine and looked down at a flat field in the Aleutian fog and made the last decision of his life, is somewhere in a cemetery in Tokyo, among names that could not be recovered. He gave the Americans everything. He meant to give them nothing. He was already dead when they found him, and what he left behind in that bog shortened the Pacific War by a margin that no one can calculate precisely, but that every historian who has studied it acknowledges was significant. From a drafting table in 1937, with a specification that every other engineer declared physically impossible, Jiro Horikoshi built the finest carrier fighter the world had ever seen. It flew from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It accumulated more aerial victories than any other Japanese aircraft in history. And the engineering obsession that made it magnificent, the absolute refusal to accept any weight that wasn't necessary, became the reason it could not survive the war it helped start. The Zero was not defeated by a better plane alone. It was defeated by what the men who built it had refused to include in it, the margins that would have allowed it to adapt. If you know a story like this one, a moment where one person's decision changed something enormous that most people never heard about, write it in the comments. These are the stories that deserve to exist somewhere other than archives. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the Pacific War is full of them. And remember, the last thing Horikoshi wrote about the machine he spent his life building. All I wanted to do was make something beautiful. He did. It just couldn't save the men who flew it, and that is the heaviest thing an engineer can carry.